Episode 12, Emotion is the fast lane to the brain. Have you ever been giving a presentation or telling a story, and halfway through you notice that people are looking down at their phones? You can see them typing on their phones. They're not looking at you or paying attention to you. And at that point, you know you've lost them. They're disengaged. And the reason for this is simple. You haven't triggered them in any way. You haven't stimulated an intellectual or emotional response. They don't care to hear what you have to say because, well, they just don't care. And what it means for you is that at that moment, they think you're boring. Now, I have never, in all my years coaching hundreds and hundreds of speakers, met a boring person. But I've watched some painfully boring presentations. How about you? I want you to hear this, and I want you to get it deep down in your soul. You are not boring. You're not. You're fascinating. You're interesting. But you are quite capable of giving a boring presentation or telling a boring story if you don't understand how to use emotion to trigger an emotional response in your listener. In this how-to episode of Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life, you'll learn why emotion is the fast lane to the brain and how you can trigger an emotional response in your listener, your audience member, your coworker, with the goal of keeping your audience engaged throughout your entire presentation so that when you get to the end and you make your point, they're right there with you. No checking messages on their phone, no doodling, nope. They're engaged and interested. Emotional triggers make them care. Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life 20-minute podcast. I'm your host and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you practical storytelling hacks, techniques, and holistic approaches that will make your stories stick. Stories that sell you and your product or service. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, please click on the follow or subscribe button. Now, here's a preview of what you'll learn in this episode. Number one, why it's essential to trigger an emotional response in your listener or audience member. Number two, how you can trigger an emotional response with some simple presentation techniques. And number three, where the emotional moments in your story live so you won't skip over them. All right, let's get started. If you listen to episode 11, The Neuroscience of Influence and Persuasion Through Storytelling, you heard about how great storytelling can make changes to the brain of the listener. The effect of emotion in storytelling is that it triggers the limbic system in the brain and ensures that your story, your message, moves from short-term memory to long-term memory. And that's what you want, right? You want people paying attention while you're telling the story. But more than that, much more than that, is that they remember your story and talk about it long after you tell it. Emotion is the fast lane to the brain. I want you to hear that. Emotion is the fast lane to the brain. First, you trigger an emotional response. They feel something, react emotionally to something you said or did, some moment in your story, and then you follow with the lesson, with the data, the point. Emotion grabs them, stimulates them, holds their attention so they care about what you're saying, and then, boom, you go straight to their brain with your point or lesson. So how does this work? Okay, try this. I want you to recall a childhood memory. Any childhood memory. I'll wait while you find it. Got it? Yes? Now, I want you to take a moment to dwell with that memory. See it. Feel it. Where were you? Look around. What were you doing? What was going on? Who else was there? Were you alone? Were you with some other people? Now, and this is critical, what happened? Why are you remembering that moment? What happened? In my experience, having done this exercise with thousands of people, one of two things happened that made that moment stick. Number one, something painful or scary or dangerous happened. You got hurt or got in trouble or something frightened you. Something went wrong. Or number two, it was a sweet and beautiful moment, a lovely memory, maybe with someone special, a happy memory, something to cherish. So here's the question. Would you agree that there was an emotional component to the memory that you just came up with? Happy, sad, painful, glad? Molecular biologist John Medina, in his book, Brain Rules, had a good explanation for why you remember a childhood memory from decades ago, but you can't remember much of anything from a boring speech filled with facts, data, and bullet points from 2 weeks ago. He writes, quote, "When the brain detects an emotionally charged event, the amygdala releases dopamine into the system. Because dopamine greatly aids memory and information process, you could say it creates a Post-it note that reads, 'Remember this,'" end quote. That's why you remember that moment out of a gazillion moments from your childhood, because it was an emotionally charged moment. It imprinted in your long-term memory. Now, here's an example of how this works, something that happened to me. I had an experience back in 2018 when I was delivering a storytelling presentation to a room of about 250 people. There's a point that I make about identifying what makes a good story, a story that you'd want to tell. And the point I make is that your story doesn't have to be profound or dramatic to be effective. You just need a meaningful moment to build around. And I follow that by telling them that I've made a good living telling stories for 20 years, but I don't have any big, hairy stories, nothing profound or dramatic. I haven't climbed Mount Everest and lost a limb in a car accident. I've never had cancer. And when I said it, that I'd never had cancer, it hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stopped for just a few seconds, I stopped dead in my tracks because I realized in that split second that that statement was no longer true, that I didn't have cancer. And I recovered from the shock of this realization and said to them, wow, I can't say that anymore because I do have cancer. I was just diagnosed with prostate cancer a week ago. And I kind of took a beat because I was feeling that in my stomach. It hit me right there at the front of the room. And for a few seconds in the middle of my presentation, the energy in that room changed. It was tangible. It was very still. And then I continued on and finished my program, the same program I'd done hundreds of times. And when I finished, I got a standing ovation, which surprised me. I mean, it really did, because other than that one moment, it was the same presentation I'd done many times, hundreds of times. I don't think I got a standing ovation because my presentation was better than ever before. I believe I got it because I was triggered emotionally and had the openness and vulnerability to stand there in front of them and tell the truth. They felt it. It was like an electric current that spread across the room. My emotional trigger, which I literally felt in my body, triggered their emotional response. Because a standing ovation is an emotional response. I'm sorry, but it is. What happened? What made that powerful? Let's break it down, because you know how I love to do that, to break it down so that you can learn how to do what I did spontaneously, but to do it deliberately. There's a couple of things that make moments like that work. Number one, honest and real emotion. I felt it and they felt it, because emotion is a form of language, a language that everyone knows and understands. It's a universal language. It was a moment of genuine authenticity. Quite simply, I told the truth. I didn't hide it. I felt it and they felt it. So number one, honest and real emotion. Tell the truth. Number two, I stopped talking. I just stopped and felt it. It only took about 5 seconds because, quite honestly, the moment caught me by surprise. The realization caught me by surprise. But technically, and this is the technique that I want you to use, it's called to hold the moment. Once you identify the emotional moment in your story, and you need to know where it is in the sequence, stop talking. Stand still and stop talking. Hold that moment like you'd hold a newborn baby, gently and delicately. Don't describe what you felt at that moment. Whatever your reaction was, stop, feel, react. Just hold that moment for a few seconds and feel it. Yes, right there while they're all watching you, stop and feel. Hold the moment. And while you're holding the moment in silence, and this is the emotional trigger, your audience member feels it in their body for their purposes. In the silence, when you're not talking, you feel it and they feel it. That's the emotional trigger. No one will be looking down at their phones. Nope. Emotion is the fast lane to the brain. You got them. So number one, feel the emotion. Be real, be honest, tell the truth. Yes, this takes courage and vulnerability, and it may be uncomfortable, but the upside is that they're blown away and remember your story. And the downside is, well, if you don't do it, they start checking their email and you lose them. And then number two, stop talking. Hold the moment. Let the silence speak. And the moment doesn't have to be a big, huge emotional moment. Come on now. You don't have to cry. You just need to be real to feel something. Joy, relief, happiness. Feel it first and then describe it. Or anger, frustration, confusion. Feel it first and then describe it. It's the one most powerful moment in your story or speech. Hold the moment. That's how you get emotion into your story or your speech. Now let's go back to your childhood memory for a second. How old were you at the time of that memory? What do you think? It was a long time ago, right? And it's still with you, still living in your long-term memory. And in order for you to use emotion to your advantage, you have to choose a story that contains a moment of emotion. And that means that you can't expect to get an emotional response with a story that's safe, that doesn't require you to share something of yourself, something from your personal or professional life where you felt something, learned something, experienced something. And those moments exist around obstacles and challenges, personal challenges, mistakes, failures, small disasters, or big disasters if you have them. The emotional moments in your story occur around steps 4 and 5 in the 9 steps. Step 4, encounter the obstacle, and step 5, overcome the obstacle. In step 4, encounter the obstacle, that's where we have the frustration, the anger, the confusion. And in step 5, overcome the obstacle, that's where we have the joy, the relief, the happiness. So after you finish listening to this podcast, I want you to sit down with pen and paper. Pen and paper, please. It works better that way. And pick a story that has some emotion in it, some joy or sorrow, frustration or shock, anger or elation. And chart the emotional moments in the story, encountering the obstacle, the moment of surprise, the highs and lows, and visualize yourself telling that story. But instead of just telling it, feel that moment or those moments. Stop talking. Hold it. Be authentic. Now, some people would call this a pregnant pause. It is not a pause. A pause is an empty space filled with nothing. This is an emotional moment filled with emotion. It's quite different. So remember, when you feel it, they feel it. When you're triggered, they're triggered. However, when you simply describe the emotion without feeling it, they start checking their emails. You need to be more compelling than what's in their phones. Remember this, emotion is the fast lane to the brain. Hey, here's an idea. Write that down in big block letters on a 3x5 card and stick it up in front of your desk. Emotion is the fast lane to the brain. Now, at this point, you might be wondering about something that I said earlier about having prostate cancer. Are you curious about that? And if I never closed the loop on that, many of you would be left unsettled because you want to know, do I still have cancer? And the answer is no. The cancer went away. I'm cancer-free. Woohoo! But the point that I want to make here is this. Step 6 in the 9 steps of story structure is to resolve the story. Tell your audience how things worked out. And since talking about cancer is inherently emotional, I need to resolve the story. I'm cancer-free. Don't miss this step when you tell an emotional story. All right, that's it for this episode. Hope you liked it. Now, if you feel that you learned something valuable today, there are 2 things I'd like you to do. You know the drill. First, click on the follow or subscribe button. And second, share this podcast with 3 people. Forward it to somebody. Tell somebody else about it. Help me spread the word about storytelling that sticks. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about story selling. Sell it with a story. How you can use a story to overcome an objection, answer a question, or close a sale. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. And if you want help with your stories, speeches, or TED Talks, please get in touch with me. My email is doug@dougstevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.